It is my privilege this morning to begin by welcoming the 48th president of Georgetown, Dr. John J. DeGioia. His full biography is in the program. I'm going to read the highlights. You can, in the conference program, you can read about his leadership of our $1 billion capital campaign, the largest facilities expansion of the campus in Georgetown's history. You can read how he has strengthened Georgetown's Jesuit and Catholic identity, deepened engagement both globally and within Washington, D.C., in the governmental and commercial and economic life of the city, but also more significantly for me, the neighborhoods and the underserved areas of Washington, D.C. What the official biography doesn't fully give a picture of is the way that Jack DeGioia is a true son of Georgetown. He was a student athlete here. He was an RA, a hall director, a graduate student in philosophy, dean of students, member of the philosophy faculty here, and has served various administrative roles, including the role in which he hired me. And on a personal level, I want to say that it was his vision and commitment that showed me that Georgetown was a place where I could come and continue the work that we're all engaged in here this week. And so I thank him for that, and I welcome President John J. DeGioia. Thank you, very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis. I want to thank you for those kind words and for your great leadership here at Georgetown and for your great work as chair of this year's conference. It's been a privilege for me over now almost 2 decades to have the opportunity to work together with you, and it's a privilege to have this opportunity to be with all of you this morning. I know you're continuing what you began earlier in the week today with this 31st AJCU conference on multicultural affairs. And I am grateful for this opportunity for us to come together to discuss the important issues that have framed your conversations this week, which are so important to the strength and the fabric of our communities. I wish to thank the CMA board, led by Dean Mabel Milner of Holy Cross, for all they've done to make this past week such a success. We had a chance just the beginning of last week to be together with a delegation from Holy Cross at the Tri-Province Conference that took place at Loyola University of Maryland, and well, we have some close ties to the folks at Holy Cross, and it's great to be able to welcome you back to campus and know that we celebrate the great leadership that you now have at Holy Cross. I also wish to thank the Georgetown CMEA staff and conference planning team for their hard work and for the many volunteers who have helped to make this event possible. I know since Tuesday, each of you have been engaged in work that is essential to the strength of our respective institutions and to the larger mission of education and social justice, which we all share. As we gain an ever deeper understanding of how best to support our students of different cultures and backgrounds, as we gain a deeper understanding of questions of identity, of the dynamics of inclusion and equity, and of how best to engage in dialogue about our differences, we are growing together in this shared mission, in our ability to provide the context in which our students can thrive and become their most authentic selves. This work is deeply rooted in our Catholic and Jesuit tradition, to ideals such as educating the whole person, pursuing excellence in teaching and research, fostering community by respecting and celebrating the diversity which animates our campuses. Just last month, Pope Francis spoke to a congregation in Rome about this last ideal, about the richness and beauty in diversity. And we hear a deep resonance between his words and the work that we engage in this week. He spoke about, quote, the diversity of charisms and gifts with which the Holy Spirit enriches the church in each of our lives. He then goes on to speak about the importance of such diversity, of seeking unity and harmony, but not uniformity. He he remarks upon the Spirit's unique ability to, quote, awaken diversity, plurality, and multiplicity, while at the same time building unity. This is work we are engaged in together as members of the AJCU. We believe that it is only in awakening diversity, plurality, and multiplicity that we are able to create an authentic sense of unity within our campuses. And we do this for our mission, we do this for our students. In our contemporary context of globalization and an increasingly interconnected world, this work of building understanding, of learning to engage our differences in a respectful and substantive manner, and of seeking an overarching unity with our sisters and brothers around the globe, this can't help in this context but to have a global resonance as well. We seek to educate women and men who are prepared for lives of service to others and for the responsibilities of global citizenship. If we can provide our students with the very best context in which they can engage questions of their own identities and in which they can grow an ever deeper understanding of the many cultures and backgrounds that comprise their university and their local communities, we're also helping to provide them with an experience that can serve as a foundation for citizenship, be it national or global, a citizenship that seeks a connection with others and one that seeks unity. While the contemporary context for this work is relatively new, global engagement has deep historic roots in the Jesuit tradition. Since it was founded in 1540, the Society of Jesus has been engaged in a global mission of identifying the greatest need around the world and striving to meet it. It has a long history of engagement with different cultures and of developing deep understanding with individuals from diverse backgrounds. And this is the tradition and history on which this morning's first speaker will present. And it's my privilege to introduce him to you this morning. Dr. Tom Banchoff is the director of Georgetown's Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. The center's research, teaching, and outreach programs explore the intersection of religion and ethics with global challenges of democracy, economic and social development, interreligious dialogue, and peace. One of its initiatives is a program entitled The Jesuits in Globalization, which examines the contributions of the Jesuits both historically and in our increasingly global context. By bringing together leading scholars and practitioners, the project seeks to explore Jesuit innovations and Jesuit legacies in the areas of mission, education, and justice. In addition to his role as director of the Berkley Center, Dr. Banchoff is a professor in our Department of Government in the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. Through his research, he explores issues of religion and ethics and world politics, most recently the author of Embryo Politics, Ethics and Policy in Atlantic Democracies, and the editor of several books on religious pluralism and global politics. It's a great honor for me to have this opportunity to be with you this morning, to be able to offer these brief remarks, and now to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Tom Banchoff.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out. I want to thank Dr. DeGioia for his generous introduction. I especially want to recognize Dennis and his team for putting together this wonderful conference. I'm delighted to be a part of it, to share some of our work here at Georgetown, at the center that President DeGioia introduced. It's especially wonderful, and I've never spoken before an audience like this, but to be with professionals from other Catholic and Jesuit institutions, a wide variety of institutions, perspectives, and roles, but I think we all share a commitment to diversity in our communities, not just as a reality, but as something positive to be embraced, to be developed, and occasions for dialogue like this, the structured dialogue you've had over the last several days, are really important, I think, in sharing our experiences, building towards best practices, but also overcoming some of the internal divides within our institutions. And I want to come back to that toward the end of my remarks. I will, though, focus in on some of the themes that Dr. DeGioia mentioned in his opening remarks. Tell you a little bit about the center. I believe you got some propaganda, if you will. I'm a social scientist. I'm using that in the sort of value-neutral sense of the term. Some information about what we do. One point of confusion is that we don't have anything to do with the University of California at Berkeley. So let's clear that up. Mr. Berkley is a member of our board of directors and a great supporter of our work. And the title is, of course, an expansive title, Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. But I think with this audience, you'll agree, there's an institutional resonance with what we're doing at Georgetown there, with what you're doing at many of your institutions. Religion, of course, not as the be-all and end-all, but as something critical to our identity. Religion that's open to other traditions and to the wider secular world. Peace as one of many normative ideals that we embrace along with secular colleagues, of course, but one that's very deeply rooted in our own Catholic social teaching with its ideals of justice and solidarity, care for the poor, as well as peace and intercultural and interreligious dialogue. And of course, world affairs, which I think we're all called to be engaged in. It's part of the DNA of our institutions to be of service to our wider communities. And we're here in Washington, D.C., in the capital of the sole remaining superpower. And we have a real responsibility and an opportunity here at Georgetown in particular to engage with the wider policy community, to bring these ethical issues, issues of religion, culture, and values into the policy debate and discourse. So that's a lot of what we do. I'm not going to go into detail. As I said, you know where to find us now on the web to learn more about what we do. We've got 7 faculty, about 8 different staff working on various research, teaching, and outreach projects related to this intersection of religion and world affairs, issues like global development, human rights, diplomacy, and so on. What I thought I would touch on in maybe 10, 15 minutes, so you're not going to hear a 40-minute lecture. I should have said that at the outset. 10, 15 minutes is a couple of programs, the work on the Jesuits and Globalization that Dr. DeGioia mentioned, another program, the Doyle Engaging Difference program here on campus, to give you a sense of how we're trying to link our academic mission of teaching and research back to the community, back to the work that many of you do. I know you're also involved in the educational enterprise. But speaking as a faculty member, I thought it'd be interesting to kind of come to you from that point of view, share some of our research and teaching in these areas, and maybe that's something we can dialogue about as we'll have some time after my remarks, how to bring those different elements of our life together on our campuses more closely into sync, into a good fit with one another. So the Jesuits and Globalization, you heard a little bit already. Like most successful projects, academic projects in administration, it began with an individual, a passionate individual, my colleague Jose Casanova, great name, a great guy. I said he's a passionate individual. What I meant, that slipped out. No, he's a wonderful guy. He is a Spanish origin. He studied with the Jesuits in Austria, became a sociologist, went to the New School in New York, where he had an illustrious career as a sociologist of religion. Came to Georgetown. We were able to recruit him to the center, in part because he saw the vision that I've just laid out, the importance of bringing the history of the church, the Jesuits, some of those ideals into the academy, shedding light on the current processes of globalization, but also looking back in time and history to see what lessons there are there. And that was the genesis of this project, which, as President DeGioia mentioned, is looking at education, mission, issues of justice, and the history of Jesuits, their global engagement, which of course goes back to that first great era of globalization in the 1500s and 1600s and extends right up until today. Part of it's sort of academic historical, to look at how the Jesuits moved out. Let's not forget, this was part of a missionary, a colonial enterprise, moved out around the world to China, India, Latin America, right over here to Maryland. We're part of a missionary enterprise, but as you will know, so often stood up to some of the secular authorities, pushed for basic respect of the humanity of indigenous peoples around the world. On the margins, we're able to have a positive impact on that process of globalization. The thing that I want to focus on here, and is one of the main themes of that project, is not so much the Jesuit experience of globalization, the history of that impact, as a certain approach, understanding of globalization, what I would call an intercultural approach or understanding. Right? This notion that in going around the world and spreading the gospel, you not only recognize the humanity of the other. I mean, that's important, and we shouldn't take that for granted. That's critical. But the notion that there's also something to be learned from different cultures and civilizations. The idea that God, or the truth, if you want to use a more secular metaphor, is present in different cultures, that these are not cultures to be obliterated, but to be engaged with in peaceful dialogue. One should learn their languages, one should learn their ways. One should let that experience of encounter with the other, that intercultural encounter, link back to one's own reflection on one's own faith. And this is a dynamic we also see in the history of the Jesuits. Again, I don't want to idealize it, but there's certainly moments already in the 15th and 16th centuries, Matteo Ricci in China, for example, becoming a Confucian scholar, learning the ways of the country, Francis Xavier in India, where you can already see an intercultural sensitivity that is developing. And of course, it's something that we're proud of at Catholic and Jesuit institutions as part of our identity, especially since the Second Vatican Council, right? When the Church in the 1960s fully embraced the idea of universal human dignity, the idea of religious freedom and interreligious dialogue. And the Jesuits, of course, have been at the forefront, out in front, sometimes getting in a bit of trouble, right? Out in front on this idea of engagement, of learning from others, of the educational process as also being one of intercultural dialogue within our institutions, but there's also a global dynamic at work here. The whole idea of the project is that this approach to globalization is more relevant than ever today as the world is becoming more interconnected, and we cannot, I don't even want to use the word we, but the so-called West cannot simply export its particular conception of globalization centered, say, on markets or rational individuals or the Judeo-Christian tradition or the Enlightenment tradition, whatever you want to call it, can't simply export that tradition. The world is shifting, populations are shifting, powers are shifting. We have a landscape now which is more heterogeneous, which is less uneven, where there really can be dialogue in a spirit of equality, in a spirit of truth. And I think those are ideas embedded in this Jesuit experience that can be a contribution to the wider debate in our societies and the wider policy controversies we're engaged in. I just want to finish this point with a quote from the current Father General of the Jesuits, Father Nicolas, the leader of the Jesuits, based in Rome. Jose and I had a chance to speak with him last December about the project, and he really underscored what I said before, the shortcomings, right? The failures of the Jesuits, despite all the positive contributions, the spirit of humility that we need going into this next phase of globalization. Just a quote from a speech he gave in Rome. It's on the web. It's a wonderful speech he gave last October, a self-critical speech. And the spirit of self-criticism, I think, is critical. He said, "We have not entered with sufficient depth into the cultures where the gospel was proclaimed in order to see that part of the kingdom of God that was already there, rooted and active in the hearts and relationships of people." And that spirit of humility, that embrace of intercultural dialogue, we see it in this new Pope, Pope Francis, which is a wonderful development, I think, for all of us. And of course, his being a Jesuit links him back to this tradition that I'm explicating. All right, what does this have to do with our work at Catholic and Jesuit institutions, our efforts to promote a greater dialogue, a deeper dialogue about diversity, a greater appreciation of diversity? Well, we're trying to take these insights and have them inform our work with students outside the classroom, but also inside the classroom. And I thought I'd say a few words about that, because I know it's not the center of gravity of this conference, but it's very much linked with the kinds of discussions that you're having. We've got something called the Doyle Engaging Difference Program, funded by an alumnus. He's actually a very successful businessman, has a global corporation that he runs, and through that global experience is so aware of the importance of understanding of difference, of intercultural dialogue, of moving beyond tolerance to really building communities of diversity. So he gave us some money to experiment creating a core group of faculty. Not trying to manage the whole curriculum from above. I don't know what it's like at your institutions. That doesn't work all that well at Georgetown. It's hard to bring the faculty along, but there are faculty who get this, right? And to work with them to take themes of diversity, whether it's race, ethnicity, culture, sexual orientation, and integrate those themes into existing courses to challenge kids to reflect on diversity through in-class exercises, speakers, readings, and so on. Make it a kind of cross-cutting theme across our curriculum. And also document the courses with reports, have an online platform. Try to create a culture of appreciation of diversity and the engagement, the cultural and intercultural encounter in the classroom and in our work. And as I said, this kind of thing, from my experience, only works when you get a core group, and we've done that. We've got a couple dozen faculty who've taught these seminars, these courses with us, and they tell their friends about it, and the students demand more of it, and we've started to really build out in the last few years this theme of engaging difference across the curriculum, which I think really reinforces a lot of the great work that Dennis and Rosemary, who I'm sure you met, or Shiva with the LGBTQ Center are doing here at Georgetown. So I'm happy to talk more about that specific program, other things that we're doing as faculty to try to deepen the conversation on campus, linking it back to this intercultural ethos that I described, which has these historical roots that we're looking at so carefully. And I would say, and this is again sort of a spirit of self-criticism, that when it comes to dialogue, diversity, there's some gaps on our campuses we don't always see, and I've alluded to them already. We're learning now to see all the different dimensions of diversity that I mentioned. We're aware of the differences between staff, students, and faculty. And certainly, it's interesting looking at the material for this conference. It mentions students and staff, doesn't mention faculty. I'm sure there's some faculty here, people who teach. I'm sure other faculty have spoken to you. But if you think about diversity and dialogue, there's a lot we can still do. And I'd love to hear about what's happening on your campuses to engage with one another across those cultural divides, if you will, on our campuses, to think through the issue of building rich and diverse communities that span student life, that span research, that span, most importantly, teaching. And I've given you a sense of some of the ways we're trying to push that agenda forward here, but I look forward to, in the time remaining, engaging in conversation with you about best practices at your universities. And of course, I'm always happy to talk about the Berkley Center as well. So, thank you. We have a couple of mics. Is that what you've done in the plenary sessions? Maybe not. I'm happy to moderate, but maybe you can... All right. And please stand up briefly and introduce yourself. You guys know each other, but I'd like to get to know you better.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Nunez from Cincinnati, Ohio, Xavier University. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer there. And I agree with you that the curriculum actually has to be the epicenter of this constellation of work that we are concerned with. I'm curious that at so many of our Jesuit institutions, we have been very slow to support the kind of critical epistemologies, those centered areas of study that would seem to me to anchor the kind of authentic, mutual, intercultural dialogue that we espouse. Black studies, women's studies, working class studies, particularly relevant to our institutions, Irish studies, and so forth. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that, and how you see perhaps critical partnerships emerging out of those centers on campus in which other cultures and ways of knowing have subjectivity and are not simply objects of what students study.
Well, that's a wonderful set of questions. It touches on so much. There are different ways to approach it. Maybe I'll say a little bit from the point of view of a faculty member who's seen the developments that you've described, the emergence of centers and programs, an important and positive development, as you say, to give voice, you use the phrase subjectivity, give voice to different communities and their experiences which have historically been excluded from academic discourse. Of course, it would have been better, it would have been perfect had those conversations emerged within the disciplines, among the faculty. What we've got now so often, and again, what I'm hearing about Xavier's, I know it's true at Georgetown and elsewhere, is a kind of compartmentalization of these different identity studies programs to the point where they're not maybe even talking to one another. Even though they share a lot of the, you use the word epistemological, they share a lot of the knowledge commitments, the ethical and normative commitments with one another. But just to get the conversation going between women's studies and African American studies and LGBT studies and so on, within and across institutions is difficult. But that's the architecture we now have. And I think what we can do, I see the only way forward is to work with faculty, especially younger faculty who are more likely to get it. And as our faculties become more diverse, we're more likely to have a critical mass of people working across these different programs and get them in dialogue with their home disciplines, government, sociology, anthropology, economics, because whether we like it or not, that's still the way the academy is organized. And of course, to get tenure, that wonderful prize, you've got to appeal to and speak to that constituency. And so sometimes it puts shackles on our young colleagues, and we should support them and give them the opportunity to participate in the wider discourse, to be active in these centers without paying any price in terms of their personal development. So you've identified a whole series of issues. The one, and I'm just really raising more questions, but there's one other, you used that fancy word epistemological, and what that evokes for me is the kind of debates about postmodernism, post-structuralism, and I think that's another negative legacy that we've got, that so many of the identity studies, if we want to call them that, have been taken over by, if you will, a certain theory of knowledge which is skeptical of universals. And I think, skeptical of, but also open to rethinking what it means to be a human being, the human person, human dignity. The idea that there is something like truth, there is something like the human person, there is something like human dignity, I think, is part of, again, the DNA of our institutions here. And that's a positive conversation, I think, that can be had across these different identity studies, centers and initiatives, but also across colleagues who are more traditional in their epistemology and those who are more postmodern or post-structural. That's another huge challenge. Yeah. Question up here? Yeah. Well, maybe not to the back.
My name is Rosetta Dara from the University of Scranton. I'm also the diversity officer there. My question touches on the globalization piece. And the current model of globalizing our campuses is taking students to Kenya, to Uganda, to Ghana for about 2 weeks. And it's often a guided tour through HIV villages and orphanages, and then the students come back without a total appreciation of what those cultures, those countries, those civilizations have to offer. My question is there an effort, maybe perhaps through the Globalization Project, to have perhaps the Global South speak back to the North in all its glory and totality, so that at least there is information going back and forth. That also might include scholars from the Global South, if you will, visiting the North, or students from the Global South coming and visiting the North, and so on. Are there efforts to have a two-way traffic, if you will, in that regard?
You mean a two-way dialogue?
Two-way, well, that too.
Wow, that's a mind bender. No.
That too.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of creative work going on, a lot more that can be done. I mean, just take the example of these massive online open courses, MOOC discussion. I mean, how we're reproducing in that discussion some old tropes, some old ideas about how we from the center can inform the periphery, can share the benefits of knowledge with the rest of the world. That's all good. I mean, that kind of sharing is important. But the notion that we have something to learn from folks in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia about especially these global challenges we're all facing together, environmental challenges, immigration, economic, social development, it's still hard to get people's mind wrapped around that notion that as we move into this next phase of globalization, it's got to be more dialogical in that original sense. And how does that reflect back on our students? So that's one way in which I'm thinking about it, this MOOC discussion. And we're working on that a bit at Georgetown, and I'm happy to go into more dialogue about that. But your specific question is so key about student experiences. It's particularly acute, just the 2-week trip. But even a semester abroad, right? We have to be careful. I mean, how much real immersion is going on? We don't publicize these figures, but there are lots of kids who will go, no matter how hard we try, they'll go abroad and they'll just hang out with other Americans. They'll do touristy things. They'll spend 6 months there and really won't come away with a lived experience of that country. So that when they come back, they can't communicate it in interesting ways. They have nothing to share. I mean, I'm exaggerating. At least some students fall into that trap. So we need to sort of lift up our partners in these other countries, especially educational institutions, institutions that deal with young people, get them more fully engaged in our junior year abroad programs, without watering down our academic standards. But there's a lot we can do to get them involved and get them to challenge our students while they're abroad. And related to that, we need to do a better job of downloading the experiences that our students do have, whether it's 2 weeks or a semester or a full year. They'll often come back as seniors and they'll have a huge desire to share, and we don't do a very good job of capturing that, integrating that into our work in the classroom. We're doing that, here I can make a quick little pitch for the Berkley Center, with a couple of programs I'll mention. One is a Junior Year Abroad network, which we've had up for 5-6 years now, where kids write back essays, really, extended blogs, while they're there about their impressions, their experiences. We share them online. But when they come back, and hundreds of kids have gone through this process, they get together and they work on a publication. There's a presentation. We bring in the wider campus community. We've tried to link some of their experiences back to research and other projects at the center. I think that's critical. Another thing that we're doing is an education and social justice project. Like so many projects, I've already dropped the names of a couple of benefactors, but you've got to also capture the imagination of wealthy individuals, right? We can do that if we get our story straight. It's education and social justice project where 4 students, it's very competitive. We've had up to 200 students apply for this, but 4 students come up with a research project. It's only 3 weeks because these kids are busy and we don't want to support them for the whole summer. It has to be carefully prepared, and they go and they're hosted by a Jesuit institution somewhere in the world that's working at the intersection of education and social justice. And they conduct interviews with people there. They learn about it. And part of their role, it's student research, which is another buzzword. That's great. But part of their role is also to share what they've learned with a wider audience, to shine a light on what's going on in the developing world, where there's a lot of creativity on the ground, and Jesuit institutions are great incubators of some tremendous work at this intersection of education and social justice. So we're able to bring our students into that. Unfortunately, we don't have the funds to send more than 4 a year, but it's the kind of thing that I hope would grow into the future.
Good morning. My name is Jacqueline Mack. I'm a program coordinator here at Georgetown.
Yes.
I work in the Center for Multicultural Equity and Access. One of the programs that I'm responsible for is the A Different Dialogue program. It's an intergroup dialogue program. And I wanted to just kind of pick your brain about strategies in which, that we can use in engaging faculty in thinking about learning and education that happens outside of the classroom, and also focusing on student stories. So it's great that there are these global opportunities, but it also becomes an access issue for students who can't go abroad. I was one of those students. So the intergroup dialogue program is a space where students can really help increase their own self-awareness of their own stories, learn about their biases and stereotypes of other groups, and then engage with peers to work through some of those conflicts, and then hopefully engage in community action. But it's a volunteer program. It's not a class. So I'm wondering, as a faculty member, what are strategies that folks from the student affairs side of the house can employ to engage faculty in thinking about these opportunities that exist outside of the classroom so that we can better strengthen those partnerships?
Well, you can pay them stipends, right? No, we don't want to go there. Well, it's funny, you mentioned student stories. I think one way into this is to think about faculty stories. In other words, you approach the faculty member as a person with a story. And everyone likes to be approached at that level. Everyone wants to be valued for their story. And students, I remember being a student and being really interested to learn more about my professors and how they got to where they are and what struggles they went through and how they engage with questions of diversity. And so on. I can't resist telling a story that I've told Shiva before. One of my dear professors at Yale, where I was an undergrad, was a fellow by the name of John Boswell. Some of you may know him. He was a famous historian of the church and of the Middle Ages, and outspoken gay man as well in the 70s and 80s when it was more difficult to be that. I took a couple of classes with him. Just a wonderful, generous man, a brilliant scholar. But I also experienced him twice outside the classroom. Once in front of an LGBT, we didn't have that phrase back then, but that kind of audience where he could speak openly about his struggles as a homosexual in the academy, in the church. He was a religious believer. And it was just incredible for us to be able to connect with him there. He had a lot of charisma, so that helps, right? Not every story is that compelling. But then that same year, he gave a talk at the chapel, St. Thomas More at Yale, about his Catholic faith. It was incredible. And a different audience, a different story, but both those stories intersected in amazing ways, and you can tell it had an impact on me. So I would say, and I can work with you, I'm happy to try to identify some colleagues with interesting stories. It's not just flattery that you approach them on that level. There's really something that they can give and that the students can pick up on that might enrich the dialogues, and that can be a bridge to all kinds of other things, like you said, integrating these themes into the classroom, raising awareness among faculty about these issues, and really making students feel like they're part of a wider academic community. That bridge between faculty and students is a real problem, especially the so-called senior faculty or tenure-track faculty, where in a lot of our institutions the perception is there that they're sort of unapproachable. So there's one idea. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm going to respond to that on multiple.
Could you introduce yourself?
I'm getting ready to. I'm Carla Scott. I'm from St. Louis University, where I'm an associate professor of communication. So I'm representing faculty. We don't have two heads. We're not pariahs. We're just prickly. Probably because of that tenure thing. So in addition to representing faculty, I'd also like to speak to the intergroup dialogue question, because at St. Louis University, we do have an intergroup dialogue initiative, and it's also for credit. It's a class. Because for the last 13 years, I've served as Director of African American Studies. I discovered intergroup dialogue, went to the Michigan Institute and said, I can offer a class. And I was able to do that. In 2 weeks, I stepped down as Director of African American Studies. I said this to some of you. And I'll be working in the Dean's office as an Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion. And one of my primary goals is to develop intergroup dialogue across the College of Arts and Sciences, because my dean, Michael Barber, who's a Jesuit, fell in love with the concept. So I feel like I have I have grace because I have support from above. One of our strategies has been to partner with the Cross-Cultural Center. Is LaTanya Buck here? Some of you know her. She's the director of the Cross-Cultural Center at St. Louis University. We began, I think in 2009, with an individual there at the time who had been trained in intergroup dialogue. A group of us went to the Michigan Institute, which is a wonderful way to build capacity for faculty. When we came back, we started building it, and I have been the instructor of record, only because I haven't had time to cultivate others and help them develop their capacity, but that's one of my goals. We struggled initially to get students, but because the Cross-Cultural Center is the place where students come and center and find community and a home, this past semester in the spring, we had to turn students away because we want to keep it at 15 students. Yeah. It does fulfill a requirement in the College of Arts and Sciences core curriculum for cultural diversity. That's a double duty class. I'd be happy to talk to you all about that later. I'm not real happy, but at least we have one. And it also fulfills a requirement for the social sciences in the College of Arts and Sciences. I put the paperwork for both of those. So I'm working diligently. I'm a little tired, but now I can focus exclusively on that and some other faculty initiatives. And I've been talking to folks from the Doyle Initiative, and I find it really attractive to develop a cohort to help me do this, because I'm not naive enough to think I can do it all by myself. You need a coalition of the willing, of those little prickly faculty people. But I'd be willing to bet there are folks at your institutions who'd be interested in doing this if there's some sort of plan and infrastructure in place. So giving a shout out to intergroup dialogue, let me just close by saying I think Jesuit institutions are the place to do it. And also for credit, not to take away from what any of you all are doing, but this is a way to bridge that gap, because this is, if nothing else, our mission supports it. So if anyone says, why should we do this? We can say, because God says so. I mean, and I often say that to students and even to faculty.
Is that your best argument?
It is. I don't think we need any other, because for faculty, you know, you come to this institution, you understand this mission. And I've said to people, and I know I'm senior faculty, so I can say this in certain ways, but that's right. For some of us, it gives support to what the kind of work we want to do, like me. My disciplinary training in communication is intercultural communication, and I've studied primarily race, gender, and class.
Great.
For others who come there, it's a little eye-opening, but I think they start to develop a real affinity for the mission. So I think it gives us everything we need to do this work, and there's work out there, I think, that can engage us across differences and produce students who really do transform the society. And by the way, that's what I'm naming my intergroup dialogue initiative, Dialogues for Transformation.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing. That's a great...
See, faculty aren't that bad.
Well, that's a great testimony, and a couple of things you mentioned there that haven't come up so far. The importance of supportive administrators, right? Thank God for that. And that's critical to get anything moving. And that can help to grease the wheels when it comes to difficult issues like, does this count for credit? And what programs does this count for? And that's a battle, right? That's a struggle, kind of a cultural struggle where we've got God on our side, but also some really good ideas, right? Any other questions? Comments? Are there any students here? Raise your hands. All right, let's bring a mic over here, a couple students here. I've got the prerogative of the... See, I'm acting like a professor here. All right. Let's hear what you guys have to say. Your thoughts, your reflections, or a question. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Kenneth Tong. I am a student at the University of Scranton. I basically do a lot of student work focused around multicultural issues and embracing cultural diversity among the student population in Scranton. One of the biggest things that I find to be interesting is that when we talk about student life, a lot of the students kind of push it aside because they're so focused on their academic careers and focusing on their studies. So I guess my question to you is, how do we find that bridge between the academics and the student life, and also show the students that in order for them to better themselves, they need to find what they study through their academics and implement it into student life and also other things in their careers?
Well, that's a huge issue, and you raise a lot of important questions and challenges. We've had a series of reports on student life, and maybe Eitan, you could say something to this after I finish. Eitan, a recent graduate of Georgetown, who's helping with some projects. And part of it is, institutional politics and so on. But remember, there are larger structural forces at work. I mean, the college experience is getting more expensive. And so we can no longer go to kids and say, you really shouldn't be working 20 hours a week somewhere else. We've gotten to the point, I think, institutionally where we kind of don't want to know. Because if we knew the amount of time being spent making a living, eking by, while enrolled at a full-time institution, it's different if it's a part-time or evening program. We'd have to really confront those trade-offs that you described so well. You've got work, you've got academics, you've got student life, which has those diverse components like hanging out with friends and partying, which is important, but which can take over. And then the kind of community building that you're all engaged with. And I'm sure you must feel like you're fighting a battle for every minute or 15 minutes or half hour in a student's week, given some of these wider structural pressures. I think we need to have a more open dialogue about that and about some of the trade-offs that are involved. Eitan, tell us about the Student Life Report and what you've been doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Eitan Paul. I work with Tom at the Berkley Center, and I graduated last year. I worked on this Student Life Report, was involved in some interfaith programs on campus as well. In the Student Life Report, one of the things we talked about was intellectual life, and we were trying to propose a series of recommendations based off of best practices at peer institutions on how to make student life easier and more vibrant. And I think a big part of that does have to do with making, basically lowering the barriers for students to engage with one another on an informal basis. And if it's easier for them to find space to meet together, to have space that is specifically dedicated for student use, to be able to, manage their student organizations in an autonomous way, then that can foster more creativity and make it easier for them to make connections between their academic studies, their social life, and create a real academic community. So we tried to identify some of the kind of logistical barriers that we felt were impeding the ability for students to really organize on their own and have places where they could feel comfortable getting together and engaging one another. But yeah, I don't have any easy answer. It's definitely always a challenge to think about everything in an integrative way. I think both in terms of our studies and trying to make more interdisciplinary connections, but also in our entire academic life, making sense of the whole. So yeah, I don't know if I have too many good specific things, but we tried to, through a study, kind of identify best practices on at a kind of technical and logistical level that might make it easier for students to have greater autonomy and control over their experience.
How about you? You want to jump in?
I'm Raquel Jones-Jefferson from Fairfield University. I'm a grad student there in the education field. I came here to get some perspective on how to get graduate students to not only come to the evening programs, but really get involved in life on campus, and then by choosing a Jesuit institution, how to take that into your studies outside of campus. Like, I'm going into early childhood education. How do I translate Jesuit mission, what I'm learning on campus as far as diversity into my classroom, and how can I get my colleagues to see that it's important to let our voice be heard on campus and also translate into the field in which they're going to as well.
Well, thank you for sharing that and for bringing the graduate student perspective. I often think we talk too much about generalities, making a difference, building the citizens of tomorrow, transforming the world. How does that actually happen? Well, for a lot of our graduates, it goes through graduate school and into the professions. Law, medicine, and business, in particular civil service. And to conceptualize that as a track, and to look at the continuities between the undergraduate experience, the graduate student experience, and the work in these various professions, and to take the ethos we're talking about, celebration of diversity, intercultural awareness, social justice, and have it extend in a dialogue with our students as they leave to go to graduate school, as they move into the professions, I think can help to put some real flesh on this skeleton, this discourse about changing the world. And there are lots of positive efforts in that direction. And too often, the graduate school experience is something that's left out because so many of your offices are really focused on undergrad. So the work that you're doing is really important. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're just about out of time anyway, so thank you.